what are your thoughts about putting together an experiment to create an innovation unit and setting it up right from the start?
Yeah, I mean, as long as I think that that's a good I think it's a possibility and could be useful as long as you know what the hypothesis is that you're trying to experiment against.
What
And
I'm
it,
saying is that I want you to help me come up with that.
yeah, I mean, so that would be the series of, again, the continuing that series of questions, right?
Right,
Is how do we going to dig into what your purpose is? What's the infinite game you're playing here? What are you trying to get out of it? What are you going to be held accountable to
right,
relative to the results? And then we can devise a plan for how do we put together the right experiment in order to see if you're where you are, right? To
right,
find out. And what you're the purpose of the experiment is to learn something and find evidence. So we're going to need to go figure out what evidence we're looking for. Is it, do you know what has, so if we were to continue that discussion and we were to drive in even deeper, we'd start talking a little bit about what you believe to be true about your organization today, and what things that that you believe, that, and how you believe that's either going to benefit or not benefit you going forward in the future. Why do you want to do this? You're talking about changing something. I'm going to
right,
change something. I'm going to create an innovation lab or whatever it is. Okay, so if you're going to do that, why do you think you need to make this change? What is it about your current way of doing things that leads you to believe this is a change you need to make? And
okay,
dig into that more, so you start to uncover what are the underlying beliefs and issues that it's funny, we have this discussion, is that I've been through this before, and asked a lot of these questions, in terms of
that's why I'm
trying to get
asking
to
you.
that,
Yes,
right?
yes,
um, so it is, and sometimes you get the answers, and they end up changing, but that is, part and parcel to you got to know why you want to do it. What is the, because it can't just be, you know I've seen so many. I've got a good friend who runs an innovation center that, started on the back of, like so many do, on the back of Shark Tank, right?
okay,
Some CEO really likes Shark Tank, loves Mark Cuban or Mr. Wonderful or whatever it is, or they've
right,
seen, Dragon's Den in Europe or whatever it is, and they're like, we need to do that, right? And they don't really know much more about it other than, let's get ideas, let's offer some money for the best one, and have them pitch them,
hmm,
and we'll spend some money and we'll implement, we'll get the best ideas, and right,
okay,
and and that becomes your purpose, right? Is to deliver a Shark Tank experience.
hmm,
And so I've got a friend who's been down this road and been through that, and he talked about how disastrous that was, and even the things that won are no longer even known about anymore. They kind of disappeared into the ether. But but what they were able to do was build a culture of the coolness of submitting ideas and getting feedback. They did a really good job across all of the ideas that were submitted of giving people feedback and building up a better understanding of the problems they were facing,
right,
and why, so they leverage that. This guy, I'm giving him credit. I'm gonna leave him nameless because I don't want to go, but I give him credit for understanding that, hey, I can leverage a bad idea, doing my own corporate Shark Tank, into a good idea by using it as a mechanism to teach people about our causes, our problems, and our long term, and getting them interested that way.
right.
um, so a lot of times you have these discussions and you never know where they're going to go with the CEO. Why do they want to do a certain thing? But you've got to figure that out, so that you can figure out how to drive it, in the most effective way possible.
Right, right. No,
I
that's
don't know
that.
why I got on
Yeah,
that particular subject. I mean, but I think that that's kind of one of the, again, I think I said this earlier, is that one of the big failings of turning up an innovation lab is not knowing why you're doing it.
right, right. I think that that's definitely. I mean, that's a perfect use case for this concept of turning projects into experiments. The CEO or whoever spoke saw this Shark Tank idea and thought they immediately turned it into a project as
Hmm.
if, but if they had turned it into an experiment, they would actually start thinking about what are the success factors before going into that and becoming a lot more defined about measurement and things like that before they even started doing this. And
Hmm.
you know from what you told me, it wasn't a failure. They actually turned it into some lessons,
Yes.
and it wasn't. But in some people's minds, maybe it wasn't. In the mind of the CFO, maybe it was a failure because he
Right.
couldn't quantify
Yeah.
this
For
work.
the people inside the company who thought this was going to lead to their next $1 billion idea,
Right,
it felt like a failure
right,
because they had an unrealistic expectation going in of why they were doing it.
right,
Um, but to the people who wanted to leverage it as a learning mechanism, and who saw it as a vehicle to get information to the employee base,
right.
um, they found it to be a great success.
Yeah, and then
Now,
yeah,
they've been able to take all of the things they created in order to deliver the Shark Tank. They took all the stuff they created and now use it for a different purpose. But they've got the infrastructure, and they don't have nearly as many people working on it anymore. But it's much more valuable
right,
because they were able to learn from how they rolled it out and what they, and the mechanisms they created for it.
right, right. And that goes to another point about all the innovation labs who get started and then they get shut down.
Hmm.
And did the organization learn the right lessons from that experiment? Because if you shut down the lab, what does that mean? You're not innovating anymore? Are you going to innovate in a different way? Are you going to go back to the ways you used to innovate when you thought it wasn't enough? Um, so this is like a typical thing that a lot of people do, is that they fail, whatever that means, uh, and then they quit instead of saying, you know what, let's look at this 2 or 3 years of experience that we had here and
Right.
design the next lab better. Set our
Right.
expectations based on reality of what we learned about our own culture, our own organization, instead of, but if you quit, you just lost all of that experience and
That's right.
the lessons. That's a much bigger failure, in my opinion.
Agreed. No, I agree with you. That's not atypical,
You're right,
in the corporate space. I mean, you start these things with the wrong set of expectation, the wrong area of focus, and without really knowing why you're doing it or the reason you're doing it, changes, and you don't recognize it. Um, and then there's some well-known statistics out there. I can't quote them. I don't have my hands on them right here, but of the number of labs that get closed. They started, they close, and then they usually reopen again a year or two later because they realize that there really was something we should have been doing here. We
right,
just didn't realize what it was.
right,
Um, and it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing for companies to do. I mean, it requires a substantial amount of people change, and people are hard to change.
right,
They don't, it's people do not act in their own best interest a lot of times, and there is this notion, that we can take experts at what they do today and put them in charge of things, and it's a completely different skill set depending on what you're trying to deliver. So if you don't know that going in, uh, you're going to suffer. You're just going to
right.
suffer.